Tonight on The Late Debate, former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt brands the NHS a rogue system. We talk to him about his leadership ambitions.
I've never hidden the fact that, I one day might want to return to frontline politics, but I don't think now is the moment for a change in our Prime Minister.
The winners and losers of Crossrail as the long-awaited line opens and new investment pours in. Will some areas be left behind? And Labour triumphs in the local elections in London, but it's by no means a clean sweep as the Tories fight back. Good evening and welcome to The Late Debate. Jeremy Hunt is the longest-serving Health Secretary ever, but nearly 4 years after moving on, he admits he made mistakes. The South West Surrey MP has published a blueprint for reform of the NHS. In a new book, he brands it a rogue system.
Well, I do use that phrase because sometimes that's how it feels to families who are shut out when they have a complaint about something terrible that's happened. But I think it's also important to have some perspective. The vast majority of NHS care is absolutely brilliant. My 3 children were born on the NHS. They mended my elbow when I broke it last year. But the question is, when things go wrong, as they do, are we as good as we should be at learning from mistakes? And the argument I make in this book is that we make it really difficult for doctors and nurses on the front line to be open and transparent when things go wrong, basically because they're worried they'll get fired if they do.
It's almost like a cover-up culture.
It is like, certainly a blame culture. I think it can become a cover-up culture. And what I discovered doing the research for this book is this is not just a problem in the NHS, it's a problem in healthcare systems all over the world, that we have developed this normality about death and tragedy. It's sort of seen as a cost of doing business. Half of us die in hospital, and the vast majority of times without any error happening, it's just life. But because of the frequency of death in the system, we don't challenge it in the way that would happen in other industries. And the result is that it becomes normalised. And this is, I think, what's most heartbreaking and what I hope comes out in the book. The tragedies are repeated, and a family can be bitterly upset and angry about why their child died, only to find out that another child dies for the same reason in the same hospital a few months later.
And a lot of deaths are avoidable.
Absolutely, and the NHS itself is probably in the middle of the pack in terms of healthcare systems, but it's about 150 preventable deaths every week in the NHS in England. If that was the airline industry, that would be an aeroplane falling out of the sky every single week. We would change things pretty quickly if that was happening. In healthcare, we've come to accept it, and I don't think we should. And if we want the NHS to be the best healthcare system in the world, as I passionately want it to be, then this book says, what are the things we need to change to make that possible?
Obvious question, you were Secretary of State, longer serving than any other. Why didn't you fix it?
Well, I've made some progress. I've tried, when you write a book, it's inevitably subjective. I've tried to be honest about where I think I made progress. By the end of my time, we had 3 million more patients using good or outstanding hospitals, big rise in the NHS budget, many more doctors and nurses. But there were some failures. I didn't fix the social care system. I wanted to have a 10-year plan for the social care system, just as I secured for the NHS. That didn't happen. I think there were things I could have done better in the junior doctors' strike, another big challenge I had during my time.
As chair of the Health Select Committee, you've had your own investigation into the pandemic. What do you think the government got wrong?
It's really difficult to sum that up in one sentence. Let me try. The government did some things very badly wrong. If we'd adopted South Korean test and trace right from the outset, we could have avoided those lockdowns in the first year altogether, and that would have been massively less disruptive. But at the same time as they were making those mistakes, they were also ordering 400 million doses of vaccine before we even knew if it would work, and we ended up with the best vaccine programme in the world. So I think history will judge that we did some things well and some things badly.
There's a growing body of opinion that seems to think that the lockdown was an overreaction. Do you?
I think that we now know that if you isolate people who have the disease quickly and do it in a very scientific way, you can avoid lockdowns altogether. So that's the gold standard. That's what they did in South Korea, Taiwan, many parts of Asia. Then, if you fail to do that, I think the evidence suggests that you do need people to change their behaviour, but if people will do it voluntarily, as in Sweden, that can be just as effective as doing it legally as we did here.
The police have announced today that the Partygate investigation is over. What did you think when you heard about what went on in Downing Street?
I think everyone was shocked that people who were making the rules didn't observe the rules that they themselves made. I think also people understand that this was a time of very, very high pressure for all the people working in Downing Street. And I would say when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, I'm not trying to defend what happened in Downing Street, but when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, the first European war in our lifetimes, one country invading another, potential for nuclear weapons, that does give us some perspective on an issue which understandably upset a lot of voters.
Do you think the Prime Minister should stay?
I don't think now is the time for a change in leadership in the United Kingdom. We have been the most robust member of the Western Alliance at a time when that has been more necessary than ever. And I think the only person who would be pleased if we had a hiatus of several months while we had a Conservative Party leadership contest would be Vladimir Putin.
If and when that vacancy does come up, are you still interested?
Well, I've never hidden the fact that, I one day might want to return to frontline politics, but I don't think now is the moment for a change in our Prime Minister. You've
talked about your passion for the NHS. If you were offered the job again of Health Secretary, would you take it?
I think after reading the book and seeing all the mistakes I've made, Simon, I'm not sure the NHS would want me back. I have to say that Sajid Javid is doing a very good job. He is totally committed to tackling these deep-seated problems. I hope that when he reads my book, as he's kindly said he will not make some of the mistakes I made, or at least know some of the things that I wish I'd known right at the start of my 6 years.
Jeremy Hunt, thank you for talking to us.
Thank you.
Now, Crossrail finally opens next Tuesday, 3.5 years late and £4 billion over budget. It promises to transform journey times and usher in a new age of commuting. The Crossrail bounce should be felt all the way from Shenfield in Essex to Reading in Berkshire. The Prime Minister has called it levelling up in action. We've been to Woolwich to see what difference it will make. On the south bank of the Thames, Royal Arsenal Riverside is a huge housing development with a unique selling point. It boasts its own Elizabeth Line station, and people living here are about to enjoy the long-promised fruits of Crossrail.
It's going to change my commute from 50 minutes to 13, which is going to be a game changer. It means I get an extra half an hour with this little man.
We wanted to move here because of the accessibility, because of the Elizabeth Line. My work is going to be in the city, so it was quite important for me to be able to get to work quite easily.
What I'm happy about is that it's going to Heathrow. You don't need to get a cab, taxi that will cost you God knows how much. So yeah, it's going to make a big difference for a lot of people in Woolwich actually, lots, not just me, lots of people.
But Woolwich is a tale of two towns. On the other side of the tracks is the town centre, a long neglected corner of southeast London. It seems a world away from the shiny towers and well-ordered streets of the Arsenal.
The big challenge is to get people to cross that busy road that separates the Arsenal and the rest of Woolwich, to come into the town centre and spend their money in local businesses, local shops, local services.
Woolwich is in Greenwich, one of the most deprived boroughs in Britain. The local council has paid £15 million for the privilege of having an Elizabeth Line station and hopes it will be a catalyst.
We're working with investors to revitalise our town centre and bring back a high street fit for the 21st century, and we know that the Crossrail station here in Woolwich is really going to accelerate that growth and provide a boost to what is a very difficult market at the moment.
Transport for London, which runs the Elizabeth line, believes the railway will be delivering benefits to communities along its route for many years to come.
This railway has been built for 100 to 150 years, and they will be talking about what we created, and we should be immensely proud of that, and I think London will be immensely proud of this fantastic railway. It's been a long wait. Crossrail has been delayed by 3.5 years. 5 days from now, the Elizabeth line finally opens. And joining me in the studio is the Labour MP for Battersea, Marcia de Cordova. For the Conservatives, it's the Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner MP, David Simmons, and for the Liberal Democrats, the Richmond Park MP, Sarah Olney. Welcome all of you. David, at the royal opening of the Elizabeth line this week, Boris Johnson couldn't resist a pop at Sadiq Khan over cost overruns and delays. Is it time to celebrate rather than have petty recriminations?
I suspect Crossrail's been in the planning since at least the 1840s, so I think everybody involved in this can probably take some credit. But you're absolutely right, it's a time to celebrate. It's going to make a big difference. We'd like to see Crossrail 2 coming down the tracks before too long, because London's transport system is already struggling for extra capacity. But I think this is really good news, and I know from the investment that we've seen in other types of the rail network around London, it will make a big positive difference to people's quality of life.
Are you excited about it, Marcia?
Absolutely. This is a real example of a Labour mayor delivering for London, and we all should be excited for it. And the official opening next week, in the Diamond Jubilee year, it's a big thing. It's going to boost the economy, and we all know when London does well, the country does well as well.
Labour mayor delivering 3.5 years late.
Well, it might be late, but let's be clear. We know these problems predate this current mayor, and actually it was the leadership of this mayor in 2018 bringing in a new team and now delivering. And let's just be excited about the future and for London.
Sarah, have you had a ride on it yet?
No, I haven't. Hoping to next week. Really excited. Yes, definitely. I think the thing for me is I'm really excited. It's great to have more transport infrastructure in London, and also it's not just London, but brings extends out to the wider southeast. But it is very frustrating that it's late, because that's been a real drag on TfL finances. They haven't had the revenue that they were projecting from an earlier opening, and obviously in my constituency we've seen the impact that lack of extra revenue available for capital investment has had. We haven't got the money yet for Hammersmith Bridge, and that could have been paid for many times over with the overspend we've seen on Crossrail. So of course that's frustrating, but nevertheless, as everyone else has said, it's a thing to celebrate.
I mean, it is a question. Is this the last hurrah for big transport projects in London? You mentioned, David, Crossrail 2. Well, that's something the Prime Minister actually mentioned earlier this week. Let's have a listen to what he said.
I think the real thing for us now is to think about Crossrail 2 and the old Hackney-Chelsea line, Chelsea-Hackney line. That is going to be transformative again. All the problems of commuters coming into Waterloo, getting up to North London, you can fix that with another Crossrail.
Well, it sounds like he's an enthusiast, but Sadiq Khan's got to do some work, hasn't he, to convince the government to come up with the money?
Well, I think this requires a national strategy. I think Marcia's absolutely spot on. When London thrives, the rest of the country thrives. And we need to see it alongside things like the investment in the rail networks in places like Yorkshire, in places like Newcastle upon Tyne, so that we can bring about what the government talks about as levelling up, but part of a long-term strategy, by which I mean many decades, to make the whole of the country as prosperous as the capital is.
The Mayor has suggested many times that levelling up the rest of the country means levelling down in London. Do you worry that projects like Crossrail 2 won't get the go-ahead?
Well, I think unfortunately that has been the message from the government, that they're talking about levelling up and levelling down London. And as I said earlier, it's so important that we have the investment and all the infrastructure right in London to help the rest of the country, because if London is doing well, we know everywhere else will also benefit. Now, we've done some really great stuff on rail investment. I mean, the Northern Line has now reopened. We've actually bought the tube to Battersea in my own constituency. So, there's lots to be proud of, and, we have to think long term when we're thinking about rail delivery, and things like Crossrail 2, we just can't write them off.
Let's talk about the local elections. Sarah, you had quite a good night, particularly outside London, but also you held on to 3 councils in London and made advances in Merton. Have you finally shaken off the curse of the coalition?
Oh, I think so. No one mentioned that at all on the doorstep. But, you mentioned the 3 councils we run, obviously the 2 in My Patch, Kingston and Richmond, and next door in Sutton. And I think what we were really finding on the doorsteps was people actually really valued having a Liberal Democrat-run council. They thought we'd done a good job during the pandemic. They thought we had the right priorities in terms of, trying to get people out their cars and investing in public transport and active travel and all of these things. So, they rewarded us on the doorstep. But I got to say, certainly in Richmond and Kingston, we perform way above our expectations. And what was really coming through very strongly was some of those national issues really coming through and people wanting to have their say on that.
David, how on earth did the Tories manage to lose the crown jewels of Westminster and Wandsworth?
Well, the crown jewels of Hillingdon, which of course includes both myself and the Prime Minister, stayed very firmly.
Are you and the Prime Minister looking over your shoulders after that night?
Well, we're next door neighbours, and in my constituency we held all the seats with big majorities, and we gained control of Harrow Council next door, and of course the Conservative Mayor of Croydon was elected. So there were some high points as well as some difficult points. But it's very clear people have given a message to the government. Whilst they didn't really endorse any other party instead, they wanted us to hear that it's time for delivery to happen, and they want to see some of the long-standing concerns addressed.
As David mentioned, Labour did lose 2 councils.
Labour did really well in London, as we already
so
highlighted.
You lost 3, Tower Hamlets and
we won 3
Croydon
as well. So we
Harrow.
made, we absolutely smashed it by winning Wandsworth, which is part of my patch, as well as Westminster and Barnet. And I think the national issues also did come from the doorstep. But, the Tories in Wandsworth were becoming very complacent, and people wanted a change. And we've got a Labour mayor, we've got a Labour MPs, and we've now got Labour authorities, and we will be leading and delivering for the people of Wandsworth and across other boroughs as well.
Can the Conservatives ever make gains in London?
Well, the Conservatives have made gains from a very low base in London in the past, and we know that the capital is a place that's a bit of a bellwether for national political opinion, that what happens in London tends to be reflected in due course across the rest of the country. I think that's why many of the people in my party are looking at the London results and what happened in the local elections and saying, what is it that we need to do to restore the confidence of the public and the voters so that we have re-elected Conservative members of Parliament, Conservative mayors, could carry on with the agenda that we've set out.
One thing you might need to do to restore confidence with voters is to tackle the cost of living crisis. Cost of living in London is already more expensive than anywhere else in the country. We hear that the police are talking about not prosecuting people who steal food. What do you think the government needs to do, Marcia?
I think what's clear is people are already really, really suffering in London and are having to make really
What sort of stories do you hear from people?
Difficult choices. People are unable to obviously buy food. They're making choices about, shoes, school shoes for their children, clothes, heating their homes. These are the difficult choices people are having to make. And, things like, not reinstating the £20 cut to universal credit has had a huge impact. Nearly 8,000 of my constituents have been impacted by that. But the government could actually make choices by tackling the crisis at hand, by saying, we will introduce a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. We will restore that £20 uplift to universal credit. Just this week, we've been calling for an emergency budget to tackle the crisis at hand. What's really evident is the government just don't have a plan to fix this crisis.
Can I just ask you, David, Mrs Thatcher had a windfall tax on energy companies. It's not that anti-conservative. Do you think it'll happen?
No, and it's something that I know the government is looking at. But I think the concern we have, as was discussed in Parliament yesterday, is the windfall tax raises the equivalent of £2.50 a week, and it's a one-off tax. So it isn't something that's going to fundamentally address the cost of living crisis. We had a budget earlier in the year which increased national insurance thresholds, increased minimum wages across the piece, made sure that the lower income
insurance, just April gone, actually. So that's what's happened. You actually put a tax hike in on hard-working people. So that's not making a difference.
That was alongside raising the threshold at which you start to pay it, so that lower income families start to pay those taxes later on. So there's a lot the government's done with its £22 billion package.
What the government have
done?
Can I just
bring in Sarah here?
Continue to look at it.
Sarah, Richmond Park's an affluent constituency. What sort of stories do you hear from constituents?
Yes, it is on average, but we certainly have our fair share of low-income families in Richmond Park as well. And sometimes it can almost be more difficult when you're living cheek by jowl with very wealthy people. I'm hearing people say that it's the price of food going up, and it's gone up very rapidly and going up and up and up and up. So that's the sort of thing that's... And what we tend to find as well, Richmond Park, the cost of housing is very high, as it is across London. But those costs are fixed. You can't do anything about your rent. You can't do anything about your fuel bills. So once you've paid those, you've got very little left over and less left over to pay for food. And that's the bit that's going to be really difficult. I think coming into summer, hopefully, people won't have to pay so much for their heating. But I think the real crunch point is going to come in October as the weather starts to get colder again. And we know we're anticipating another rise in the energy price cap. That's when it's going to get really difficult. And that's why we really need action now.
Marcia, the Mayor hasn't helped, has he, by increasing his share of the council tax by a record amount?
I think the Mayor's actually doing his bit, and he understands the crisis that are facing so many Londoners, and that's why, you know, things like housing costs and looking at how we can tackle some of those issues around rents and so forth, the Mayor is doing his bit, but we do need the government to really tackle this crisis. This is a government issue, and they're choosing not to make the necessary decisions to actually tackle it.
The Metropolitan Police has decided it's the end of the Partygate investigation, 126 fines, no more for the Prime Minister. Sarah Olney, he's got away with it, hasn't he?
Well, I'm not sure that he has, to be honest. I mean, he's obviously going to stay in power, but what we've seen in the local elections in so many different places that people are really running out of patience with Boris Johnson. They don't trust him. They think he's treated them like fools. And we saw in places like Wimbledon and in Carshalton and Wallington, you know, we won the popular vote in both of those places in the local election, and we very much hope that people will stick with the Liberal Democrats because they just don't trust the Conservatives.
David, are you dreading the publication of the Sue Gray report, the final publication?
I'm hoping it will bring some clarity to the situation. I know my constituents are very frustrated by what they've seen happening, and they're going to make a balanced
judgment. Is it clarity you want or closure?
Well, no, I think it's clarity that we want. We need to make a balanced judgment. We need to ensure that we've got the leadership in this country that we need to address the challenges that we face. And the investigations that are going on in Parliament will help to address that. And that will answer that question for me when I see what the evidence is.
So you haven't made a final decision yet?
I think it's a very clear message, and I had the same from my constituents. People want to see the government concentrating on the priorities that people have, and they want to make sure that they've got the evidence in front of them so they can form the same judgment that parliamentarians need to form as well.
Do you think he's got away with it, Marcia?
Well, frankly, this government just have always demonstrated just how out of touch they are, and they do not believe that the rules apply to them. He absolutely should not be getting away with it. I don't think he's even fit to be in office, frankly. And I do hope when the Sue Gray report is published that the necessary action will be taken and the Conservatives will do the right thing by this country, because my constituents have had enough of him.
Sarah, do you think it's fair to say that the Met didn't cover themselves in glory over this? They dragged their feet to begin with, and they spent the best part of £500,000 on this investigation.
I think it's just been a lot of confusion from start to finish. We know that Londoners were getting a lot of fines, and all the reports that we have and all the evidence we've already seen of the parties, it doesn't seem consistent that some people have been fined and others haven't. And I think there's a lot of confusion as to how they've come to the conclusion that they have, and of course that doesn't build trust.
David, do you think the Met's reputation's been damaged?
Yeah, I wouldn't criticise the police for their actions in this. They took a decision right at the start that they wouldn't investigate retrospectively allegations about breaches of COVID. They changed that policy under political pressure, so clearly it was going to take time and cost a good deal of money. But it is important for public confidence that we know the facts about what went on.
David, Marcia, Sarah, thank you all for talking to me. Thank you also to the Health Secretary, former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt, who was with us earlier. I'll be back with another edition of The Late Debate next month. Till then, thank you for watching and good night.